Suppose you recognize this explosive quote from literature. In that case, you've either had the pleasure of reading Dante's Inferno, or you might have indulged in the bubblegum allegory of the poem in Dan Brown's iteration. Either way, you have some ideas of the harrowing thematic inclinations of the notorious theological text, the Divine Comedy. For starters, there's nothing comedic about Dante's vivid envisioning of the 9 circles of hell, where different sinners are being punished. In the 14th century poem, a man, who is a reflection of Dante himself, embarks on a miraculous and otherworldly journey to hell, purgatory, and paradise. Throughout this gruesome journey, the man has 2 guides, Virgil and Beatrice. The Roman poet, Virgil, is the truest epitome of wisdom and knowledge. And let's just say that becomes super handy when you gotta navigate your way through the Inferno and Purgatory. While these 2 places are ideal for condemning the sinners, Virgil's holier-than-thou approach to life and the underlying annoying sense of self-righteousness is, well, fun. Yet even then, Virgil is a pagan soul because he was never baptized. Moving on, Dante's guide in paradise is Beatrice, a woman who's a spitting image of the man's former flame and his ideal woman. While the story is an epic description of the dark afterlife and gives a religious-centric, moralistic sermon to embrace the higher word of God, its approach is pretty grim and macabre. You see, when Dante is giving us a tour of the 9 circles of hell, the stars of the show are the souls that are being tortured for an array of sins. And as much as we don't want to remind you of death in the afterlife, we're going to segue into that a bit. For instance, the punishment for gluttons is to get rained on by garbage and sit in the trash while worms decompose it. Yeah, told you, it's macabre. And this is perhaps one of the more tame methods of torture from the book. Then you have the gloomy, or in modern language, the nihilists, who are forced to choke in the river of black tar for eternity, heretics being burned alive, and flatterers buried in poop. Not your ordinary poem, right? But hey, highbrow literary dudes love Inferno. I had to read it in college. Alright, it's a fun idea, but we're not doing a modern retelling of the Divine Comedy. Instead, we're going to break down perhaps the most clever and ingenious appropriation of Dante's Inferno. And no, we're not talking about the long and tedious iteration of Dan Brown. Tom Hanks has that covered, thank you very much. So let's focus on a different quote. A brilliant way of looking at life, the futility of trying to plan everything out, and the chaos of the universe. All that from Cartoon Network's animated miniseries, Over the Garden Wall. Yep, that heartwarming tale of incredible friendship between 2 brothers has its own twist with macabre plotlines and witty, intrusive stylings. But the fact that a series for children and some child-minded adults was inspired by a gruesome poetic depiction of hell and the condemned can be pretty mind-boggling. Over the Garden Wall is a classic brainchild of creator Patrick McHale, who unapologetically appropriated the Divine Comedy for some easier-to-digest entertainment, and it worked like a charm. The series revolves around Wirt and his younger half-brother Greg as they try to find their way back home after getting lost in a treacherous and nefarious forest called the Unknown. Now, that's a pretty common trope in popular culture in literary masterpieces. Yet the brothers' turmoils in the woods are highly inspired by Dante's journey through the 9 circles of hell. To be clear, the series doesn't encompass the entirety of the Divine Comedy, but it does latch on to Inferno to draw some striking and remarkable imagery of the unknown, and how the siblings find their way out. So, other than the plot, the 3 main characters in Over the Garden Wall are also direct appropriations of Dante, Virgil, and Beatrice. In fact, if you watch the series knowing Inferno, you'd be able to make all the right connections instantly. Of course, it takes a certain narrative jump to base animated, harmless characters into the depiction of hell, but you would have gotten there. Wirt is a classic depiction of Dante himself. He has an incredible affinity for poetry, has a massive crush on a girl, and, well, he likes to stay in his head. In this representation, the most striking similarity in this case is Wirt's infatuation with prose, and how this particular quirk drives most of his personality.
The obsidian cricket of our inevitable twilight singing our requiem.
Dare we say it, but just like Dante, our main character is also a huge nerd and a poet at heart. We see this larger-than-life comparison very early in the show, citing innocence when Greg suggests that the duo leave a trail of candy to find their trajectory home. Wirt's response is a recitation. He recites the following:
Though I am lost, my wounded heart resides back home, in pieces strewn about the graveyard of my lost love.
When it comes to physical similarities, Mikhail's character's recognized quirk is his red hat, which is identical to Dante's preference in his 14th century poem. What's really interesting is that Wirt, just like Dante, also exhibits some level of being an anti-hero. They don't always know the answer, sometimes they get it wrong, and they both are highly insecure within themselves. This sort of character sketch would become more clear as you watch the video, but now let's talk about Greg. We have our Virgil and Wirt's half-brother and companion, Greg. And this is where things get super interesting. Right off the bat, if we have to pick our favorite allegorical character, we'd pick Greg in a second. Nothing against Wirt though. It's just that Mikhail gives an interesting twist to this particular representation. Overall, we can see how Greg is a bard-like companion for his older brother. Clearly, this is highly reminiscent of how Virgil was a guiding light for Dante in his perplexing and life-altering journey through hell. In each circle of hell, the methods of torture are literally insane, but what keeps Dante going is Virgil's profound wisdom and knowledge and the absolute self-belief that he has been a good person in the past. And since he had spent a significant chunk down there, he knew every nook and cranny of each circle of hell. Such details of Virgil's character make him super brave and courageous while he leads his friend to paradise. The comparison's striking, right? You have a traveler who's stuck in the unknown and finds a guide in a man who seems to know everything. It's almost brilliant that Greg most of the time couldn't be more different than his counterpart while maintaining some occasional commonalities. You see, Greg is absolutely clueless in the unknown. He doesn't know what strange situation is around the corner. And he doesn't know how to navigate the woods to take his brother home safely. Yet despite being unknowledgeable about the depths of the treacherous forest, Greg is brave. And man, nothing gets more poetic than this. Because if you put this in perspective, the younger brother here has all the leeway to hold back in the journey, as he's completely out of his league here. But he takes the bigger step of navigating the depths of the unknown and dealing with the consequences later. That's precisely why we say Greg is more of a hero than Virgil ever was. On a very intuitive level, the heroic characterization of Greg seems a bit paradoxical. Stupid even. Because you can easily stand up and respond with, hey, the foolish younger brother got himself into trouble in the first place, and Wirt was dragged along with him. Sure, but as we look further, the story has a huge desperation for driving out redemption arcs in a very non-Dante way. So, all in all, the Virgil-esque bravery of Greg is almost defined by how he responds to the bizarreness of the unknown and the uncertainty it induces. At this point, we're compelled to quote H.P. Lovecraft's best-known lines. Citing the fear of the unknown, he said, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown." And we think this is critically important because this is exactly where Wirt falls short. His response to the unknown is initially very dismissive. For instance, he can't wrap his head around the fact that Beatrice is a bird who doesn't only speak but also has the prowess to guide his journey through the unknown. On the other hand, Greg doesn't show that prolonged movement of hesitancy to accept the fantasy world because certain things just can't be explained. Given the duo's circumstances, Greg's philosophy is genius. So genius that it ends up creating this beautiful contrast between the moral implications of Inferno and Albert Camus' absurdism. Alright, sorry, we know no one asked for this nerdfest, but dang, it's almost diabolical how much Over the Garden Wall is packed with philosophical reflections. And between you and us, it's also refreshing how a miniseries from Cartoon Network can philosophize a 14th century highbrow theological text that's transcendent in every way possible. So, why do we think Greg is one step further from Virgil? To start off, we've already talked about the knowledge differential between the two characters. But more importantly, Greg finds his ingenuity by avoiding one important crisis with himself. He doesn't go out of his way to make sense of things that startle him and are completely new to him. This is where the character also starts to buy into Camus' absurdism. Greg finds an edge over his older brother by implicitly accepting that the world is inherently nonsensical, tragic, and full of suffering. To search for meaning in an incomprehensible world is meaningless in its own right because, well, there's no order to fall back to. The very notion of absurdism comes from our natural desire to explain stuff, or find meaning in things like our own suffering. And all that becomes super irrelevant when nature is indifferent towards our search for meaning, because again, there isn't any. When Wirt is struggling to accept the unknown in all its treachery and weirdness, Greg seems to do the opposite, and that's what sets him apart. So yeah, Greg becomes the manifestation of this classical lyrical response from Taylor Swift. You're on your own, kid, always have been. While we're down this rabbit hole, we can also talk about why we see very different character trajectories for Greg and Wirt despite the very obvious canon. And our response is quite simple, right? The wise mentor in Dante's world recognizes the consequentiality of your actions. The souls being tortured in the 9 circles of hell are simply there because, well, they broke the completely sensical, meaningful rules that were laid out in a sacred, holy world. As opposed to the unknown, hell isn't absurd. It's just an extension of your life when you gotta pay for your sins. Cool, we aren't gonna argue on religious terms here. But if we were to place Greg in Inferno, we think he'd probably write an explosive philosophical text on finding hell completely nonsensical, because how exactly are we internalizing the complete consequences of our actions in an inherently absurd world? Okay, if you have an immense dislike for Camus, you might want to go off in the comment section. But even deep down, you know that it's a struggle to make sense of every single thing in your life, and Greg just doesn't mess with that. Now let's talk about Beatrice, who is a remarkable homage to her literary counterpart from the Divine Comedy. There are a few reasons why we find the character interesting in several regards. Over the Garden Wall features Beatrice as a personified bluebird, who is portrayed as a false hero in the miniseries. Her origin is a direct inspiration from the Inferno character who becomes Dante's guide in Paradise. In her literary representation, she's also Dante's lost lover. These particular characterizations are also true for Beatrice from Over the Garden Wall, but we'd say her character in the miniseries is also reminiscent of the Divine Comedy in another interesting way. So let's take a step back and think about why Beatrice is a bluebird in the series instead of assuming her mundane human form. From the character's backstory, we get to learn that, as a girl, Beatrice hid a sacred bluebird with stones. And as a divine intervention, or punishment, or whatever, she, along with her family, were cursed to live as bluebirds, losing all of their human agency and perks. Don't know about you guys, but this particular plotline is straight out of Inferno. That's why we talked about it earlier in the video. Hell is the philosophical and religious manifestation of, hey, your actions have consequences, and the afterlife has some torturous yet creative ways to punish you for your sins. Beatrice's trajectory in the unknown isn't different. When she was hitting those birds with stones, she perhaps didn't associate a lot of meaning or consequentiality to her actions. That's how life goes, right? Yet if you read through Dante's Inferno and take a closer look at the 9 circles of hell, you'd see that no sin will go unpunished. Alright, Lucifer isn't exactly turning people into birds for initiating violence, but it's the idea of divine punishment that puts Inferno and Over the Garden Wall under the same light. But the poem does give some interesting rules to birds in hell. It's almost impossible to not think about the uncanny similarity, but the punishment for self-violence reminds us of Beatrice's arc in the series. In Dante's Inferno, people who had unalived themselves are punished for not respecting their bodies enough, so now they must lose all human form. People are turned into trees for eternity, and some horrid bird-like creatures peck the human trees' bodies. Even the thought of this is almost frightening enough, but the purpose of this macabre retelling is to bring your attention to the canonical retention of Beatrice. And the way Mikhail responds to the absurdity of hell is pretty awesome. Eventually, we see that Beatrice and her family regain their human forms in the epilogue. While this calls for celebration, we're still not over the grim parallel between the origin of Beatrice, the bluebird, and Dante's Inferno. There, of course, are some dissimilarities too. In the series, Wirt's crush on Sarah isn't framed as a stupid teenager infatuation that would be over in the daytime. In fact, Mikhail gives Sarah a more intense direction of love that Wirt can't seem to figure out. It's almost poetic that his feelings towards Sarah landed him in a graveyard in the first place. And we know already that's when his life turns around, as he finds himself in the unknown. Now all this seems very reminiscent of Dante's obsession with his love, Beatrice. Yet since Beatrice's literary canon is a bluebird in the series, she isn't the object of Wirt's true love. Instead, she takes another, arguably more monumental role in Wirt's life. You see, Beatrice is a bluebird who doesn't mess around. She effectively calls out Wirt for his inaction and the fact that he keeps blaming Greg for their entire ordeal. In a way, Beatrice is a moral guide for Wirt, as her literary representation does the same for Dante in Paradise. What's really paradoxical about his relationship are the inherent moral shortcomings of Beatrice in the series. On numerous occasions, she tries to abandon the boys to lift the curse on her family. Yet throughout the series, we see the mediation of this conflict as both Beatrice and Wirt try to come to terms with their individual shortcomings, just like Dante and his lover do in Inferno. And of course, the retelling of hell is incomplete without the classic evil that lies within every circle of hell, and in our case, in the nefarious forest. In the depths of the unknown lies the series' very own conjecture of Lucifer, called the Beast. Just like the classic biblical rendition of Satan, the Beast of the Unknown has an all-encompassing deceptive presence to trick people into going astray. He has many thorns and faces as well. Mikhail took direct inspiration from Dante's characterization of Lucifer as a shadow-like presence in all circles of Inferno. And even when he isn't physically present, his shadow induces this weird level of eeriness, discomfort, and uneasiness between Virgil and Dante. Over the Garden Wall makes the presence of its own satanic rendition through small dark turtles. The central plotline about the beast in the forest is his incorrigible desire to keep the lantern burning with the Edelwood trees. Now, those trees aren't ordinary. They are a dark, twisted manifestation of the souls of lost travelers that couldn't find their way out of the nefarious woods. So it's in the best interest of the beast that Greg and Wirt don't find an escape from the hellish, soul-sucking life of the unknown. Similarly, in Dante's Inferno, Lucifer has a hunger to devour the tortured souls as well. But here's the thing. In many ways, Over the Garden Wall is a remarkable antithesis to the hopelessness that exists in Dante's Inferno, because what it does so subtly is turn the Divine Comedy into a more purposeful commentary on life that isn't devoid of hope, redemption, and second chances. The animated series isn't purely theological despite its robust biblical imagery, mainly because it doesn't completely stay true to Dante's condemned for eternity messaging. In fact, the journey of Wirt and Greg simply advises you to strive for redemption and goodness, even when you're plunged into total darkness. So even if we deviate from righteousness or some sort of moral trajectory, we aren't condemned. Alright, it's a bit of a snafu, yet there's always some saving grace for everyone. Sure, these characters don't always take center stage to induce some sort of messianic guide, and they surely don't ask you to pay attention in Sunday school. In fact, just like Dante, we also find siblings getting apprehensive about their journey, more dominantly in their moments of weakness. They feel lost, question how they got tangled in the unknown, and if there's any incentive to fight their way out. But the overall induced hopelessness to escape hell is exclusively Inferno's pitfall. In the poem, we first encounter the harrowing nature of hell through the inscription above its gate. The famous line reading, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." That's where this is from, if you didn't know. And the inscription stayed true to its words throughout Dante's journey through the Inferno. Similarly, we find a robust allegory of abandon all hope in Over the Garden Wall, through the siblings' encounter with a woodsman. Now, we find this scene very important for one simple reason. The woodsman doesn't leave any stone unturned to warn the siblings about the beast, who signifies the death of hope for everyone in the unknown. He isn't wrong. If anything, his revelation is perhaps the most well-sounding allegory in the series. Greg and Wirt go through hell, both literally and figuratively. Yet their adventure doesn't echo that all hope is lost for the siblings. Even in turbulent times, they seem to do their own thing. They save the dog from the beast's possession. They save Beatrice. They befriend turtles. In many ways, Wirt in particular doesn't define himself through the preconceived notions of the unknown. Instead, even in the maddening darkness of the woods, he urges himself to be the hero of his own story. This is where we see more literary understanding between Dante's journey through hell and Wirt's uneasiness in the treacherous forest. The two characters find their robust contrasts in episode 4 of the series. And well, if we had to pick a favorite episode of Over the Garden Wall, this is probably our vote. So what's so special about Songs of the Dark Lantern? This particular episode is based on the trio's struggle to find the directions to Adelaide of the Pasture, a woman who supposedly holds the secret to getting out of the unknown. Now, this bit is important for the siblings' final plan to get the heck out of the woods, but we're not going to talk about that here. We're more interested in the episode's sheer prowess in pushing Wirt to accept his trajectory as a wanderer who may or may not be lost. Either way, he just needs to keep going. After all, he's just in the formative years of finding his own path in life as he makes mistakes, searches for guidance in Beatrice and Greg, and longs for his girl crush. The climactic push makes itself known when Wirt tries to ask for directions from the people in the tavern. Much to his surprise, the keeper of the tavern is more interested in finding out Wirt's real identity or his place in life. The keeper introduces everyone in the tavern through their roles in life or their professions. Weirdly, these people don't have names. There's a butcher, a teacher, a tailor, a master, and so on. So Wirt finds himself fighting a new identity crisis. Later in the episode, things settle down when he finds a resonating label for himself. The butcher from the tavern calls Wirt the Pilgrim and a traveler on a sacred journey, while the baker tells him that you're the hero of your own story. Wirt finds a lot of potential in his identity as the Pilgrim and a hero in the making, but he only fully embraces his new yet novel labels at the end of the series. And again, Wirt's pipeline from the defeated, lost lover to the master of his journey stands in direct conflict with Dante's abandon all hope. So let's transition to that. When we were discussing the Beast of the Unknown earlier, we deliberately didn't push one very important symbolism of the Lucifer-like creature. This is because we first wanted to talk about Wirt's emergence as the master of his own journey. In the miniseries, you'd see that the Beast hardly had any theological connections. In fact, and more shockingly, it's a strong symbolism for depression and an overwhelming sense of hopelessness. Wirt's journey from feeling defeated to finally confronting the Beast and escaping is framed masterfully and beautifully. Without making it explicit, Wirt's trajectory ends up challenging the harmful connotations about unaliving yourself and the ones who suffer from its ideation. Because, let's be honest, Wirt's healing process is confusing, defeating, and pretty apprehensive. But the fact that he refused to turn into the Edelwood tree is the only benchmark that is worthy and important. In comparison, what Dante's Inferno offers us is the complete opposite of Mikhail's imagery in Over the Garden Wall. In the poem, people who had taken their own lives were condemned for eternity, while some acts of unaliving yourselves were deemed virtuous. This is a very paradoxical commentary on a highly complex and sensitive topic that impacts millions of lives. So it's honestly remarkable how an animated series from Cartoon Network does a stellar job of making its highbrow inspiration look stupid and even harmful, by today's standards at least. All in all, Over the Garden Wall is an excellent mediation of a lowbrow cult classic that does an incredible job of humanizing its source. And in doing so, it doesn't only redefine a new age of the genre, it also leaves its viewers with a powerful manifestation of being their own hero. After all, hope shouldn't die. But anyways, this has been 10K Bill, and thanks for watching. Comment down below what you'd like to hear me talk about next. Support us on our Patreon if you like this content and want to see more like it. And of course, make sure you subscribe for all your entertainment-related content.